Okay. Now, now does screen share appear?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
You can just proceed. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. I'll start. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the floor. Today, I will present a joint work with Hüseyin İkizler from Austin Technical University. And our research is the effects of major earthquakes on the labor market, evidence from Turkey. This is the overview of the presentation. First, I will motivate our research, define the economic consequences of earthquake as well as physical destruction. Then I will go through the earthquakes with major damage in the last 10 years in Turkey and which earthquakes we examined in our research. Then I will state the central question of this research. After that, I will talk about the data that we use and how we choose our model. After presenting our results, I will try to sum up the presentation. As a matter of fact, our motivation started with the project call. We saw TÜBİTAK's special call for the project for the economic effects of earthquake. And TÜBİTAK, maybe you know, is the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey and is important institution for my country. We also wrote a project proposal for the effects of the earthquake on the labor market, and our research proposal approach. And this research is the first output of this project. The most obvious consequence of an earthquake, as you know, is a physical destruction. As a result of this physical damage, the regional economy also deteriorates. The physical loss of buildings and infrastructure doesn't only cause damage in the short term, but it also results in declining consumer confidence, potential earnings, production, and quality of the workforce, and with significant economic consequences such as recession and slowdown in investment. The magnitude of the impact varies depending on the location of the earthquake and its relationship with the population and industry density. And considering for the Turkey is an earthquake zone, it's essential to determine the policies for such demolitions after a disaster. Okay, Turkey experienced disasters of various size and frequencies like the rest of the world. These disasters undoubtedly have local, national, and regional dimensions and social, economic, political, and environmental effects. According to the Disaster Risk Index published by the United Nations, Turkey occupies 4th place. And from this table, you can see the earthquakes that caused death, injury, and property loss in Turkey between 2014 and 2020. And we noticed that the earthquakes of 6 molecular weight and above have devastating effects. And this table also indicates that the earthquakes in Elazığ, for our research, we take 2 regions, Elazığ and İzmir, and İzmir caused many casualties. These earthquakes caused loss of life and destroyed the economic balance in the regions where they took place. So this study takes 2 major earthquakes in Turkey in the recent past. One of these earthquakes took place in Elazığ and the other in İzmir. And the study focused on the impact of these earthquakes on the labor market. Thus, we tried to test whether unexpected shocks have long-term effect and move to unaffected local economy towards a different long-term equilibrium. And in this research, we use the unemployment benefit application data. and the number of job placement is a dependent variable in the models. And these data are publicly available in İşkur database. İşkur is the Turkiye employment agency, and we took these data for 26 regions for Turkiye. Also, we used the monthly consumer price index, the number of companies established and closed, the distribution of electricity consumption by consumer type, housing sales, and price series. And while some of the data is presented on the provincial basis, some of it is accessible at the regional level. Before looking at the result, I want to tell you briefly about synthetic control method. We used the synthetic control method for this research. To determine how the earthquake affects the labor market, we use this method. And synthetic control method, maybe you heard it before, constitutes the natural approach for evaluating the effects of an unanticipated exogenous event that affects some areas and while leaving other units unaffected. According to proposed method, in our research, the regions forming the control group shouldn't experience destructive earthquakes. And synthetic control methods optimally select the weight set that produce an estimated counterfactual to the unit received the treatment. This counterfactual called the synthetic unit and serves to outline what would have happened to the aggregate treated unit had the treatment never occurred. This method relies on generalized difference in difference estimation, but uses stronger comparison to obtain causal effects. In our research, as I said, we employed the synthetic control method to quantify the impact of the major earthquakes in Turkey by constructing a counterfactual as a weight average of all Turkey regions that haven't been directly affected by the earthquake. One of its most important advantages for synthetic control method is using a convex combination of comparison units called synthetic control. As you know, DID, we use a single comparison unit alone as a control group. Therefore, we select the comparison unit as the weight average of all comparison units, which best resemble the treated unit characteristic in the pre-treatment period. The definitions maybe fit better when I share the result graphs. Okay, first, look at the results of the Elazığ earthquake. In the figures, straight lines treated unit and dashed lines show synthetic unit. As you see from figure 1, the earthquake increased the number of job replacement. And we know that the labor market of the Elazığ region primarily relies on agriculture. The results imply that new business areas, for example, such as construction, provide an option for the unemployment worker after the earthquake. This reasoning may increase the number of job replacement in the Elazığ region. Also, in the figure 2, the number of unemployment allowance applications in the Elazığ region after the earthquake doesn't differentiate from the control region. From the both results, we can say that the earthquake positively impact the labor market in Elazığ region. We also analyzed the İzmir effects on the earthquake on the number of applying for job placements and unemployment benefits. As you see from figure 3, the amount of job placement is in the synthetically constructed İzmir region was above the İzmir region values in the months following the earthquake. This observation clearly shows that the earthquake reduced the job opportunities in Izmir, especially in the first 2 months after the earthquake, and that the recovery process took place 3 or 4 months. On the other hand, the figure for the earthquake didn't appear to have an apparent effect number of applications for unemployment benefits. We consider that most important reason for this result is dismissal ban within the scope of COVID-19 pandemic measures, because Izmir earthquake took when 2020, when the COVID pandemic started. Similarly, the recovery in job opportunities took longer during the pandemic process. In addition, under the assumption that the job opportunities of Izmir, because Izmir is the bigger city than Elazığ, are higher under normal conditions than in Elazığ, we believe that the earthquake affected the economic recovery more than it appears. Okay, I tried to sum up now. We have analyzed the direct impact of the earthquake on the region's labor market and where the earthquake affected the most. We chose 2 major earthquakes that occurred recently in Turkey. While the Elazığ earthquake occurred in pre-pandemic period, the Izmir earthquake occurred during the pandemic period. We have shown that while there is a positive impact on labor job replacement in the Elazığ region, the initial impact of the Izmir earthquake on the Izmir labor market take almost 2 months. And we can say that full recovery after the earthquake appeared after about 4 months. Due to prohibition dismissal ban within the scope of COVID-19 pandemic measures, there was no impact of the earthquake on the number of unemployment allowance applications in the Izmir region. We have interpreted the results as the earthquake may positively impact the labor market, particularly the agriculture-oriented market. The earthquake most likely result in new job opportunities, such as construction. Besides, the earthquake may harm the labor market, particularly service-oriented market, and for such market, first 2 months are vital. Okay, thank you for listening. As I said, our research is progressing with the scope of this project. We know we have our shortcomings, and it will be more comprehensive study with your comments and suggestions from here. So this research in the beginning phase, as I say, I'm looking forward to your comments and feedbacks. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Asli. That was a very good presentation. Next paper is by Dina, Abdelfattah, Rahma Ali, Hala, Abou-Ali, and Yasmine Abdelfattah. And the paper is entitled, Is Egypt's rural youth employment vulnerable to climate change? And we have Dina and Yasmine here, so please.
Thank you very much. I'll actually start presenting myself as I explained before. If anything happens, Yasmine is going to jump in, but all is good. I'll be able to finish the presentation in the right time, and everything is going to be fine, inshallah. So our topic today is Egypt's rural youth employment vulnerability and how it responds to climate change. So I think we all know how climate change is a buzzword or is a hot topic nowadays with the COP26, COP27, talking about global warming more recently, or speaking more of global warming now more than ever, and trying to see the impact of climate change on so many economic variables. Among them is the movement of economic opportunities from one place to the other. And along with this movement, job opportunities or job vacancies are moving as well. So what we're trying to understand here with this paper is this impact of climate change and looking at it from 3 specific climate variables, which are related to temperature, humidity, and precipitation. We're trying to see how much does it affect the vulnerability of youth in the labor market in Egypt. And this is going to be what I'm covering in the presentation. So I'll go through the motivation, method, results, conclusions, and we're going to wrap up with very short and brief policy implications at the end. So the motivation, as I said, climate change is a very important topic nowadays, and evaluating its impact at the economy level is very important, and more so at the labor market level. So more recently, we've been seeing youth unemployment becoming more of a concern for Egypt over the last decades. But more than the unemployment issue, informality and job insecurity is considered to be a more alarming problem in the Egyptian labor market. And as you can see the difference in the dates between youth unemployment marked as a concern and then moving more towards informality and insecurity, we see that with time, more or issues in the Egyptian labor market are being redefined or redressed to highlight more informality and insecurity. Literature refers to this informality and irregularity in the job market as vulnerability. So the more vulnerable the worker is, or the individual is, the more he is pushed towards an informal or an insecure job in the labor market. Climate change is expected to exacerbate employment vulnerability and push workers more towards this irregularity and this informality. So this is exactly the relationship that we're trying to see. So in 2019, the World Bank came up with this report saying that we are expecting that with the further climate change to see more impact on employment vulnerability. And with this vulnerability already being a defined problem in Egypt, we're trying to see how much of it is exacerbated by climate change in Egypt. So this figure here is showing the average, 2 of the most important climate variables that we are using. So on the right, we're looking at relative humidity, and on the left, we're looking at maximum temperature. And we're going to see that most of the governorates that are suffering from high humidity are the ones that are suffering from the relatively higher temperature. So we have some governorates that are defined with higher temperature with no much focus on humidity. Others are suffering from high temperature that is compounded with higher or above maximum average humidity as well. So we're trying to see, with the focus on rural areas at the later stage of the paper, we're trying to see if this interaction between temperature and humidity is having a compounded effect, a more defined effect on the labor markets. So with the methodology, we're linking data from 2 sources. The first of them is the Integrated Labor Market Panel Survey. So we're using the rounds of 2006, 2012, and 2018. And we are doing the matching at the second administrative unit, which is the Markaz or the Qism in Egypt, just to make sure we're having the temperature or the climate effect at the most defined unit. For the temperature data, we're using National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Climate Prediction Center, and National Aeronautics and Space Administration Prediction of Worldwide Energy Sources Project, where we're able to define maximum temperature, precipitation, and relative humidity, again at the second administrative unit, which is the Markaz or Qism. So we are able to match the 2 data sets together and try to see this impact. We have a number of research questions that we're trying to answer with this paper, but the most important of them is, how does climate change impact employment vulnerability in Egypt? So this is the key research question that we're trying to address. In addressing this research question, we look at or we control for respondents' characteristics. So we control for the age, education, and income, try to control for parents' education and labor market status. We also try to see more so the relationship for the youth and in rural areas. So we're trying to have a more concerned or looking at a more detailed portion of the labor market, which is youth in rural areas. And later I'm going to say why specifically in rural areas. We're also trying to see if the impact is different between male and female. So is there a gender aspect to this relationship? And finally, are we seeing any regional disparities? Before I proceed, let me just define what exactly we mean by vulnerable employment moving forward and how are we defining the youth group. So with vulnerable employment, we're using the World Bank definition of the total of unpaid family workers, self-employed, irregular wage workers, and informal private sector workers. And for the youth, we are fixing this age group of 15 to 29. So looking first at some descriptive statistics and trying to get an idea of the extent of vulnerability and youth employment status across the 3 rounds of the survey years. So we find that vulnerable employment among youth was actually higher, is getting higher over the years. Inactive youth have been increasing between 2012 and 2018, with a decline in non-vulnerable employment and increase in vulnerability. Temperature, or moving forward, we are going to see that temperature has actually significantly increased over the 3 survey years that we're having. And this is the first motivation of why look at this relationship. So with vulnerability increasing and temperature increasing, is there a defined impact or a defined relationship here? Informality and irregularity is spread as a work status among youth, more so between 2006 and 2018. Most females are out of the labor force, while males are more concentrated in the informal and irregular job category. And this is actually confirming previous labor market studies in Egypt. Inactivity and non-vulnerable employment were found to dominate at higher wealth quintiles, and employment vulnerability is more prevalent at the side of vulnerability of the lower or at the lower wealth quintiles. We're seeing that towards the higher quintiles, the share of vulnerable employment has been increasing between 2012 and 2018. So even though between 2006 and 2012, we're seeing a decline in vulnerability or in employment vulnerability at the higher wealth quintiles, but between 2012 and 2018, a shift toward increase in employment vulnerability even among this wealth quintiles. We also found a very interesting relationship, which is related with fathers who have lower levels of education, which is mostly talking about the intergenerational spread of youth employment vulnerability. For the model, as we're seeing the impact of changes in the climate variables in the respondents' location of residence on the vulnerable employment during a given week reported by the respondents, and using the location as markaz or qism to try to have this matching with the climate variables. The spatial and temporal variation in the observation are used to capture the causal impact of temperature, humidity, and precipitation changes on labor market on changes in labor market vulnerability. Given the dependent variable that we're having, we're using the multinomial logit model, and we defined 3 particular states with one is the out of labor force or unemployed, the second is vulnerable employment, and the third is non-vulnerable employment, with the out of labor force and unemployed set as the reference category. It's appropriate to estimate the model where each individual is now considered as a cluster of observation over time. So we are fixing the 15 to 29 age group. We're not following them through time, but we're seeing the impact at each survey years over this particular age group. The climate variables, as I said, are defined as follows: the weekly average of the maximum temperature faced by respondent I in week T in location S, the average humidity faced by the respondent again in week T location S, and the average precipitation at the same week and location. We're using individual level characteristics, including age, gender, household size, female-headed households, highest number of years of education, regional distribution, father's employment and education, the respondent's wealth score at the time of the survey, and the round fixed effects. The results that we're seeing with the general impact on employment vulnerability for the factors that we're controlling for is similar to the other research in this area of irregularity or informality in the labor market. There is no much difference between the youth-specific characteristics and its impact on their vulnerability. But what's interesting is the impact of the climate factors. So looking at the most restrictive model, where we're trying to see how the rise in temperature and humidity are affecting vulnerability, we have seen a significant impact on the odds of vulnerable employment. what's more interesting is interacting both variables, which is the rise in temperature above maximum average, amplified with a rise in humidity above maximum average. We find that the odds of employment, whether in vulnerable or non-vulnerable employment, is decreasing compared to inactivity. So in areas where both effects are compounded, we're seeing more and more people leaving the labor market and either getting into out of labor force or unemployment. Among the interesting findings that we found as well is that the father's employment status has a strong effect on the transmission of employment vulnerability through generations. Rural workers have significantly higher odds of being employed in the informal or irregular job than remaining without a job altogether. So this is the main reason why we focused our next step of the analysis on seeing the impact on rural youth in particular. So re-estimating this model for rural youth, we found that all of the variables that we've been estimating are showing the same sign and significance, with more compounded effect, for example, for education. But what we saw is that climate variables are having an even more significant impact on the odds of employment vulnerability among rural youth. So the rise in temperature above maximum reported average indicates higher odds of being in a vulnerable employment. And the effect is strongest, as I said, among rural youth. Relative humidity is showing an inverted U-shaped effect, and precipitation is showing a U-shaped effect. However, again, in rural areas, the combination or the interaction of temperature and humidity is showing more inactivity among rural youth. So we're seeing that youth, especially in rural areas, end up in vulnerable jobs as opposed to non-vulnerable formal sector jobs. In multiple cases, youth prefer to remain in their status of employment vulnerability rather than being inactive. Climate change is compounding the employment vulnerability of youth, both in rural and urban areas, with a more severe effect in rural areas. It is more important actually to analyze labor market performance, not only through the lens of unemployment and inactivity, but more so through informality and vulnerability in employment. Vulnerable employment is spread across rural and urban areas, but the severity of it is higher among youth in rural areas where already formal jobs are scarce. So this has allowed us to look at some initial policy implications where rural sector development programs that are gender sensitive and ensure equitable resource distribution would improve the capacity of rural youth to adjust to climate change. Access to information, training, and services would allow the rural population to adapt to new practices that would aim to mitigate the impact of climate change and improve their vulnerability. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dina. And we then go to the third presentation on decomposing the changes in wage inequality in Palestine over time by Hatem, Jemmali, Rabeh, Morrar, Fernando, Rios-Avila, and Rachel Duwakit. And Rabeh?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present my work. Like Dina, but not due to COVID, sometimes we have some electricity disruption here. So if any, Hatem will continue, but I hope not for this morning. So our presentation today is about on decomposition, the change in wage inequality in Palestine over time. I am Rabeh Morrar, the Director of Research at the Palestine Economic Policy Research Institute, a Mass and Assistant Professor at Al-Najah National University in Nablus. So the outline, issue, and objective, descriptive analysis for the data. Then we will present the methodology and the main result, then conclusion and policy implication. So why we study wage inequality in Palestine. In the last years, Palestine experienced a decline in the consumption inequality, but in the same time, we find that labor income inequality in Palestine has an increasing trend. So this is due to different distortion in the Palestinian labor market, which is made due to the Israeli occupation and other internal distortion that we will discuss later. So our main goal here is to investigate the trend of wage inequality during the period 2009 and 2016. We have the data recently about between 2017 and 2020, so we will extend the analysis after this conference to include also the data between 2017 and 2020. We will also determine the main factors which drive the increasing in labor inequality and the contribution of different economic and demographic variables which explain the change in wage inequality, taking into account West Bank and Gaza Strip, refugee status, also economic sector and gender variable, and also the level of skills, high skills, low skills, and also the type of job. So here we find that between 2009 and 2013, the wage Gini coefficient remained stagnant around 32%, but after 2014, we find a sharply increase in the wage, the Gini coefficient, which reached around 37% in 2016. The wage inequality was coincided simultaneously with a sharp reduction in the share of the low and medium wage earners, and also increase in the share of the highest wage earners. So here we find the wage share for the top 20% and for the bottom 20% and for the middle between 20 and 80%. So in the top we find that after 2012 there is a sharp increase in the share of wage. So here we find that also from this figure that the monthly wage at the bottom of the distribution declined by 25%, while the wage in the middle decreased marginally, but increased by 13% for the upper share in 2016. So we will, our analysis will mainly based on the labor force survey, which is conducted by the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, BCBS, between 2009 and 2016. The data provide a nationally representative data set with comprehensive information, including both demographic and economic characteristics, which allow in-depth analysis of the trend for labor market inequality. We will, based on the Kitagawa-Owaka blinder decomposition approach proposed by Ferbo OL 2018. So the wage inequality will be divided into both decomposition composition effect and wage structure effect, which the wage which the unexplained variation, and composition the explained variation, and then we will divide the two effects into the contribution of each covariate. So here the unconditional quartiles regression, we did first the unconditional quartiles regression, then we decompose over the wage distribution for the main Gini coefficient and for the three quartiles. For the regression, we find that the trend of return on different characteristics have changed over time for age, gender, and some industrial and occupational variable remain significant with the same sign over the period for the regression on Gini coefficient. So here in detail, for the return to age and gender among middle-aged workers between 25 years and 44 years, the return to age show improvement until 2012, then followed by a reduction in return to Gini coefficient. The same trend was found for the upper quintile. So here, just to explain, we have we did the regression for the entire Gini coefficient, then we did it for the first quintile, middle quintile, and upper quintile. The return among old age workers above 45 years show a decreasing and positive contribution to the increase of Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient for the upper quintile is increasing, but for the old ages, it was decreasing in a positive sign. So gender wage gap contribute both to the decrease of the bottom share and the increase of the Gini coefficient at the upper quintile. Among the high educated worker, we found that the return to education, so also a significant contribution, but in decelerating the rise of Gini coefficient. So more educated or more education will decrease the inequality measured by Gini coefficient. Also, for most of the industrial covariate, we found that also increasing trend in wage inequality compared to services. The unskilled, low-skilled, and skilled occupation compared to the high-skilled, we found also increase in wage inequality. So wage inequality decrease for high-skills labor and increase for low-skills labor. In Gaza Strip also, due to the economic and political situation there and the Israeli siege against Gaza since 2006, so we found that the wage inequality increased between West Bank and Gaza Strip. Around the statistics show that more than 70% of the workers there earn less than minimum wage, which is about $400 in Palestine, but the percentage is more or less in West Bank. The coefficient show also that the premier associated with working in urban areas has a decreasing contribution to the rise of inequality. So the inequality decrease when we talk about the workers in urban area and increase when we talk about the workers in rural and refugee camps. So for the decomposition result here so we have two periods here between 2009 and 2012 and between 2013 and 2016. So for the first period, we found that the change in wage inequality are mainly driven by improvement in endowment. So this is the explained variation, but the rise of wage inequality for the second period is mainly driven by the changes in the return to characteristics. So we talk here about wage structure effect. Here from the figure for the bottom and middle share decomposition. So before we talk about Gini decomposition and top share decomposition for the top 20%, but for the bottom and middle, the overall decline of both inequality is mainly driven by changes in differences in return to characteristic. So here we talk about wage structure effect. Overall, we found that the wage structure effect is the main contributor to the increase in wage inequality in the Palestinian labor market. So the wage structure effect could balance the decrease in the outweigh the decrease in the composition effect. In more detail, for the first period, we found that the compositional differences in industrial sector, region, West Bank and Gaza, refugee status explain a significant portion of the rise of wage inequality, while gender and worker with contract contribute to reducing the wage inequality for the first period. And changes in education characteristics does not contribute to the change in wage inequality. But for the second period, we found that education level contributes significantly to the wage differentials in terms of Gini coefficient for the middle and upper quintile, and wage structure effect due to differences in return to education contribute to reducing the level of Gini coefficient for the top wage. So when we have more education, then the discrimination or the wage differences based on discrimination or return to characteristics will decrease. Occupation here, the job is found to have a small negative effect on the rise of Gini coefficient for the upper quintile. So to sum up the conclusion and the main policy implication, so we find a sizable increase in the wage inequality in terms of Gini coefficient. It was about 5% between 2009 and 2016. The co-op decomposition showed that the increase of wage inequality for the various first period was explained by the composition effect, explained by differences in demographic and labor market characteristics. But for the second period, the wage structure attribute to the main differences in the or the main changes in wage inequality than composition one. So composition effect explain the first period, and wage structure effect explain the wage inequality in the second period. The compositional differences in industry, region, and refugee status during the first years can explain a significant portion of the rise in inequality in the first period, while the wage structure effect explained by age and discrimination against female explain the wage structure effect for the second period, mainly for the upper quintile and for the main Gini coefficient indicators. Differences in return to education, occupation, and region are found to put downward pressure on the rise in wage inequality for the period starting by 2011. So more education will decrease the wage inequality. The economic policies, and so here we will introduce some policy implication. So it's important for the stakeholder or the Palestinian government to adopt economic policy and to improve the macroeconomic condition which allow for such inequality. Here we talk about uncontrolled effect, which is the occupation which contribute to the main distortions in the Palestinian labor market, the unable of labor in Gaza Strip to come to work in West Bank, and also due to the hundreds of thousands of workers who work in Israel, who are mainly unskilled workers and who have where the wage gap is increasing between workers in Israel and workers in West Bank and Gaza Strip. So we may conclude that the change in the wage structure effect was large enough to outweigh the decline in the composition effect, which translating to a sharp increase in wage inequality in Palestine. As I said, it's important to adopt economic policy or macroeconomic policy to deal with the distortion in the Palestinian labor market, which is mainly explained, which if we denote some of them, there's a huge or a large number of unemployment rate for women in Palestine, which reached 50%, and in Gaza Strip is more than 75%. Between youth, it's also more than 50%. Also, the participation rate for women in the labor market is about 16%, which is decreasing year by year. Economic growth also, even we experience some economic growth in some years, but it's based on the foreign aid, not based on the increasing the potential of our economy or our economic sector to create new jobs. So we need also physical intervention, such as policy which would have to assume the end to occupation imposed constraints, improve labor force participation of women by expanding the supply of employment opportunity for educated women outside of the public sphere. Here, even that the women in Palestine has higher tertiary education than men, but the unemployment rate between graduate women is higher than or double than men, which is maybe the same in other economies in the Arab world. So women in Palestine, mainly employed in the public sphere or in the formal private sector, due to the absence of social security, the job opportunity are very limited in the informal sector. It's important to improving the supply of these jobs and addressing the needs of women who seek to enter the workforce but are constrained by a lack of support. So here we talk about social protection for women in the labor market. There's no social security system until now in Palestine. It's important to improve coordination between the different stakeholders, public and private, and foreign donors who are the main player in the Palestinian labor market to deal with the distortion of in the labor market, mainly for to prompt the TVET, technical and vocational education for women in the labor market. The main TVET activity in Palestine are for men, not for women. There is a need to unified effort rather than fragmentation of intervention from different stakeholders. Finally, to developing a cohesive labor market policy in Palestine. There's many players, different policy from different players. So it's important to have such a cohesive labor market policy in Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabeh. That was very interesting. So, and we have Jem.
Yes. Hello, everyone. It's great to be back at an ERF conference after an absence of several years. Of course, I would prefer to be in Cairo right now at the Marriott, but not this time, but hopefully in the future we'll be back there once again. And there were 3 papers that I enjoyed reading very much. And the first one was, of course, dealing with major earthquakes in Turkey and their impact on the labor market. The paper by Aslı and her friends aimed to estimate the impact of 2 major earthquakes on the labor markets using the synthetic control method. The method is used more often to analyze the impact of major events like natural disasters on economic growth. But of course, there is no problem with using the same method for economic labor market outcomes as well. What the method does is using a number of control groups, a synthetic unit is obtained. And the control groups are assigned weights such that the synthetic unit resembles the group of interest. In other words, the treated group as much as possible. I drew this picture myself so that members of the audience who are not familiar with the method will have a better understanding of what is being done here. So you have your dependent variable. It could be like the growth of the economy or something like that. And this is the group of interest. And these are similar groups which are used for control. And as I just said, the synthetic control method takes a weighted average of these control groups and forms a synthetic unit. And this is where the event occurs, the major event occurs, like an earthquake or military coup or something like that. And then you observe what happens to the control groups. You also observe what happens to the treated group. And based on the calculations of the synthetic control method, you find the counterfactual values of the dependent variables. And you also know the actual values of the dependent variable. And there's a gap. If this gap is large, it means that there's a significant treatment effect. And I have drawn this picture so that the treatment effect is positive. Because of whatever happens, because of this major event, the dependent variable increases faster than we would expect. So this is a really nice way of showing whether a major event like an earthquake has an impact on some economic outcome. Of course, there are some explanatory variables playing a role as well, because to enhance the predictions, but I am not able to show them on this picture. And the number of dependent variables used by the authors were number of employment benefit applications and the number of job placements. And the data was available at a 26 region level. And the explanatory or confounding variables they used were the CPI, the number of companies established and closed, electricity consumption by consumer type, and housing sales and prices. And I should note, as the author did, that the Izmir earthquake occurred after the pandemic began. And at that time, firms were largely prohibited from dismissing their workers. And this makes it difficult to observe the impact of the earthquake. And I should also mention that the earthquake caused damage in a very small portion of the statistical region which corresponds to Izmir. What do I mean by this? I have this picture here. These are the 26 statistical regions of Turkey at level 2. And here is Izmir, which makes up a statistical region on its own. It has a population of more than 4 million. And as has been already mentioned by the author, the earthquake fortunately killed a small number of people and damaged a small area compared to this large area of more than 4 million people. That's why it is no surprise that a significant treatment effect is not observed. Moving on to Elazığ, the second earthquake, Elazığ is one of the 4 provinces that make up a statistical region. And once again, the earthquake is relatively small to cause significant impact on economic outcomes, but the authors were able to obtain some significant results. So I thought this would be useful to share with the audience. And after reading an earlier version of the paper, I had some questions in my mind, and here I'm sharing them with you. I'm sure some of these have already been answered in the current version of the paper, and others will be in the future. When I read the paper, the role of explanatory variables in the method was unclear. And I also noticed that the dependent variables the authors are working with are proxies for the labor market outcomes of interest, namely the regional employment and unemployment figures. Probably those numbers were not available, so they had to use proxies for those labor market outcomes. And I was also wondering why there were different numbers of control groups in the estimations for the different calculations. And another question that came to my mind was, how large does the treatment effect need to be so that it is considered to be statistically or economically significant? And that's actually all I had for the Turkish paper. Moving on to Egypt's rural youth employment. The authors did something I think was quite reasonable by focusing on the distinction between vulnerable employment and non-vulnerable employment as opposed to being unemployed. And they define vulnerable employment as being in informal and irregular jobs. And the impact of socioeconomic and climate change variables are measured. And the results show the persistence of employment vulnerability among youth. In fact, the impact of climate is stronger on rural youth, where changes in temperature and humidity show a significant impact on employment vulnerability. So the climate does play a role in employment status, in the determination of employment status, and it is stronger in rural areas. The rise in temperature above the maximum reported average indicates higher odds of being in vulnerable employment. And relative humidity shows an inverted U-shaped effect on the odds of vulnerability, while an increase in precipitation is also showing a U-shaped relationship with the odds of any type of employment. And the negative and significant coefficient of the interaction variable of temperature and humidity shows that a rise in temperature and humidity reduces the odds of being in any type of employment. So I'm repeating the results already presented by papers just in case some people just joined us. And the questions that came to my mind were why some governorates were excluded from the study, because it seemed to me like from the map shaped by the authors, some of them were not included. And I was wondering why the climate variables were defined as the weekly averages before the administration of the survey. I thought the employment status should be more dependent on a longer term climate situation, maybe not the average of the week before the survey, but the average of the year before the survey. So I'm quite sure that the authors have a reasonable response to that. And I was also wondering how the model deals with the difference in the number of times individuals are observed, because there are more than 2 rounds of the data that they are working with. And I'm not sure if all individuals or all respondents are observed the same number of times. Maybe some of them are observed 2 times, some of them are observed 3 times. And I wonder how the model deals with that. But at this moment, I should also repeat that I enjoyed reading the paper and I think it has a lot of potential. And having said that, maybe some improvement in the presentation of results is possible. The climate variables yield significant results, but the reader is not told why and how they are expected to affect the employment status. Why do we observe U-shaped relationships? And why do we observe an interaction effect? Is it common knowledge that the heat is worse when it is combined with humidity? So maybe if the authors feel the need to do that, they might collaborate with experts from the climate area, and with their contribution, the readers will have a better understanding of why and how climate is having an effect on the agriculture and in turn in employment opportunities. That's all I have to say for this paper. And finally, moving on to the Palestine paper, the authors are trying to decompose the changes in wage inequality. They decompose the changes in wage equality into a composition effect and the wage structure effect. Wage inequality is measured by the Gini coefficient and the shares of income received by the bottom and upper quintiles and the middle interquartile quintiles. And it is found that the wage inequality is increasing over time. Also, it is found that the composition effect dominates the wage structure effect. And Gini coefficient is very widely used, but the income shares of the quintiles are not. I thought when reading the paper that the readers should be told whether these shares are expected to be small or large to achieve equality, and probably this has already been answered in the current version of the paper. And what I found the most interesting reading the paper was the distortion of the labor market in Palestine as a result of employment opportunities in Israel. So I wonder, with regard to wage inequality, what would we expect to find in the absence of working opportunities in Israel? Or how would the results change if those working in Israel could be included in the survey? Because if I'm not wrong. The survey, the sample already only included people employed in Palestine. Finally, rural areas make up 1/5 of the working sample. Some people may want to know what happens if rural workers are excluded from the study. Is a comment that I made when I prepared this presentation, but I think the author already gave the answer of what happens when rural areas are excluded. And this is all I have to say about the papers. I thank all the authors for this interesting work, and I wish them success with the remainder of their projects. And I turn the floor over to Namis once again. And
thanks, Jim. Thanks, Jim. So, any of the authors, do you have any comments on Jim's comments?
So I would like to explain something, if I can start, or if someone else.
Please go ahead.
So based on the question about what will happen if we exclude the data here also including the worker in Israel. So to me, working in Israel increasing the structure effect, because the criteria that Israel used to accept workers to work in Israel is not based on composition effect, is based on mainly on wage effect. So what I mean that to give a permit for a labor to work in Israel, it's based on security issues. So if you don't have any skills but you are security clearance, then you will have a permission to work in Israel. So it's not based on the characteristics of labor or any demographic or economic criteria. It's based only on age. For example, you should be 35 years and above and married, etc., to have a permission to work in Israel, as well as I told you, it's security clearance issues to have a permission to work there. So to me, because of the wage gap between a worker in Israel and worker in the local economy, so if we exclude the laborers who work in Israel, then to me, the wage gap will decrease mainly which based on wage structure effect. So this is what I expect, but we will check when we exclude the laborers in Israel, what would happen to the decomposition effect for both composition and wage structure effect. Based on your question about using income or as a to-wage Gini coefficient, so there is a number, maybe I didn't mention in the PowerPoint, that wages in Palestine explain more than 80% of the income for household here, for individuals or people in Palestine. So it's the only way to measure the Gini coefficient. There is no other statistics in Palestine which can refer to the income away from wage. So, and if we exclude the rural area, I'm not sure what will happen, but also we will check that in our new version. So maybe if Hatem would like to add something.
Hi. I want to give an answer to Cem Hoca. Okay, firstly, how large does the treatment effect need to be so that it's considered to statistically significant, you say? And we learned while doing this study, because we learned that we need to run a test to assess the significance of the effect, and it's very new. Maybe you know Scott Cunningham have had a causal inference book in 2021, And we will do this statistical significance test in our paper. Thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
And also you ask why are the different numbers of control groups in the estimation? And it takes the convex combination of the control group for estimation and assigns a different number of groups to control group for each of these. For example, sometimes the model can only take 5 out of 26 groups. It's only about the optimization problem. Thank you for your comment and suggestion.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll actually join my colleagues in thanking you very much for the very valuable comments, and I'll actually start with the second set of comments about understanding more this climate impact, and this is actually where we are now with improving the paper to give it this dimension of understanding more so how is this relationship defined from a climate specific perspective rather than from a labor market perspective. On the first set of comments, I'll just give a very brief, not answers, but highlights, and we're definitely taking them into consideration for further exploration. We did not exclude any governorates from the study. Actually, we used all the governorates that were in the ELMPS or in the ILMPS. So there was no intentional exclusion of any of the governorates from the study. Climate variables defined as a weekly average. This has been a very long debate actually amongst us as a team on how to define the climate variables. And in the ELMPS survey, there is a definition of the employment status for a week or a 3 months period. And we actually prefer to use the weekly or the 1 week reference period to make sure we're capturing as little variation in temperature as possible, because if we extend it to a 3 months period, we're mostly moving from one season to the other. So it could normalize or naturalize the impact of the climate. And we were a bit worried about this. So we prefer to have the 7 days to have as much as possible capturing the right impact of climate change on this week's definition. So this is more or less our answers. We are expanding our paper by dividing the regions into the relatively more hot regions to the relatively cooler regions and trying to see again the impact of humidity along with this. And we're also trying to look at the persistence of vulnerability for the younger ones. So the ones who are started 2006 survey at the age of 15, 16, 17 will still be within the defined age range as we get to 2018. So the other thing we're looking at is the persistence of employment vulnerability moving from 2006 to 2018, again, from a climate change perspective, holding for all other shocks that happen in the economy. So again, thank you very much for the very enlightening comments, and we'll definitely take them into consideration.
Thank you very much all for a very interesting and active session. I guess the next step is to actually modify your papers, and then you're going to send it to Mrs. Hoda Azmi, I guess 6 weeks from now after implementing.
Yes, I have.
Sure. Hi, Hatem. Hi, Hatem.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Fine.
Hi.
I have just reply for comments about the wage inequality in Palestine.
Sure, please go ahead.
It's a suggestion of an improvement in the paper by adding a robustness check, based on remarks on introducing and excluding rural workers. I think that it will be a good idea to do a section, to add a section dealing with robustness check by including and excluding the rural workers and other groups to improve the empirical analysis of the paper. I think we will do this improvement to get a very good paper and a very interesting paper. And thank you a lot for these comments and this interesting improvement and suggestion of our paper.
Thanks, Hatem.
Also, thank you, Kim, again. But if you would you send us your comments by email to handle with, or?
Yeah, Rabeh, I guess Huda will send you all the comments by Jem right after the conference, I guess. And she will be sending the deadline for receiving the modified version for your papers to be processed after all for the working paper series. Thank you all very much for this very interesting session, and hope to see you in other sessions. So join us, and sorry about the inconvenience for the link of the session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next year.
See you, hopefully, yes, face to face, hopefully, yeah. Yeah.
Any plans to go do it in Cairo once again, or what?
I hope so. I hope so. Okay, see you. Bye.
Bye.